Well, let's look at a couple examples here. The first one is Iridium. Is anyone familiar with the Iridium phone system? Okay, it's covered in the book. Iridium phone system. The original premise of the idea occurred in the late 1980s. Okay, so cell phones were available. Legend has it an engineer was on vacation in the Caribbean at a beach. The beach did not have phone coverage in the form of copper wire phone system or cell coverage, and was involved in a residential transaction trying to buy or sell their house back in Arizona. And because they were incommunicado for 24, 48 hours, somehow the deal fell through. And the engineer came back to the Tucson plant for Motorola. Motorola is a very well-regarded, respected, strong engineering company. Talked to one of the Galvins, who was CEO of the company at the time. The Galvin family controlled the majority of the stock, and a Galvin was running it, and said, hey, I just had this horrible experience. I was unable to get a copper line. I was unable to get a cell phone line. I had, kind of a personal loss. I was not able to get this residential transaction done, residential house transaction done. I have an idea for a new phone system. And the idea for the new phone system was use a satellite-based system. If you look at that upper right-hand corner globe, the whole idea there is, and you probably can't see it from the back, it shows a series of satellites orbiting the Earth. And the way a satellite phone system would have to work is the satellites have to have line of sight to each other. So if I was emanating a call from here in Auckland and I was calling home, Austin, Texas, the satellite over Auckland would pick up my phone signal. It would beam it through a series of satellites up to the northern hemisphere and beam it down to Austin, Texas, and the call would be completed. That's the quick, simple explanation of how the product worked. And Motorola is a very engineering-oriented organization. They have built a lot of really good communications products over the years. They were a supplier of cell phones at the time and a supplier of the semiconductors inside cell phones, and they were getting significant pressure from the Nokias and other suppliers. They were feeling pressure, and they felt that if they could come out with a new infrastructure and sell some components in it as well as own it, that it would help their business quite a bit. And it's a very, very logical business decision when you think of it from that angle. Now, if you want to motivate engineers, you tell them that I've got a really, really hard problem and I'm not sure you can solve it, okay? And this is my emphasis on usually products get shipped. Building an Iridium phone system is an enormously difficult technical task, right? You got to build the satellites, you got to power the satellites, you got to figure out the hardware, you got to figure out the software, you got to get them shrunken down to small size, you got to get them to fit in the nose cone of a booster rocket, you got to build a few extra because the booster rockets are notorious for blowing up on the pad. You got to get all these components that work in a very austere environment of space. And despite the space shuttle and the space station, it is hard to go up and kind of change the batteries on these things on short notice. So you really have to think a lot of tough engineering things through. And they did. They moved a lot of technical mountains, filed a lot of patents, had all kinds of interesting stuff, interesting innovations. They raised money from a lot of different players. All the major telcos in the world invested. Many venture funds and private equity funds invested. Bill Gates personally invested. My point is, strong company, strong technical founding, good investors were behind this. Reasonable business idea. But what they failed to recognize was where was their target market. And what they did to figure out their target market, international phone calls are taxed by all countries, and it's a good source of revenue for the government. So they're tightly monitored, and it's easy to get the data on them. So they sat and analyzed their spreadsheets and saw, I've got 1 million calls going from New Zealand to the United States, from the United States to South America, to, and 1 million in, 1 million out every day times, 70, 80, 90 odd countries. oh my goodness, there's $1 bazillion of business here. If I can get 1% of that, I'm really going to be, I'm going to have a really great company. And their theory was international travelers, international business travelers, like any of us in the room, would pay a premium for a single phone number that was usable anywhere in the world. Kind of single phone number, single voicemail. And with that as basically the market grounding, they built the product and they launched the product. Okay, $8 billion later, in about 1992, the system was ready to go. For those of you who remember it, full-page ads in the Financial Times, The Economist, the Wall Street Journal, all the spiffy, higher-end international business publications. Very esoteric ads, very like, the world is wonderful. I'm standing on a cliff holding my Iridium phone, and the sky's in the background, and I can talk to anyone kind of ads. And nobody used the phone system. Absolutely nobody. I think they had like 80 calls in the first couple weeks. And again, figure out $8 billion, as I've said before, one of these days I'm going to figure out how much money that is per hour to pay back. But you need a lot of calls coming through the system to justify an $8 billion investment. And what happened was the product simply didn't sell. And they went through 3 different sales and marketing organizations in a vain attempt to get it into the market. And I'll give you the aftermath of what happened and sort of the failure of the company and the resurrection of the company. But the point I'm trying to emphasize here is they did not analyze the market beyond some very cursory work to figure out that the numbers were really big. Okay? They did not go in and spend a lot of time talking to international business travelers. They did not understand the usage patterns. And if we were doing market validation, I would have done a couple things. Well, first of all, let me tell you about the system, because it had some shortcomings. And again, being an engineering organization, Motorola figured people would live with the shortcomings, okay? Because the technical solution was so elegant. And the types of shortcomings were, first of all, the handset. There's a later handset shown in that picture in the upper left-hand corner, but the original handset was about as big as a World War II era walkie-talkie. It was big, it was bulky, it needed a lot of battery power. It actually came in a briefcase. Because you also needed a lot of sliding components depending on where you were. You actually had to, kind of adjust and configure the thing using hardware insert cards, kind of like a PC. That was one thing. The other thing is, because these are signals coming from satellites, have to travel a long way down to Earth to pick up the handset, the signal strength by the time it got down here was pretty weak. And the challenge was the signal started off strong and it got progressively weaker, but it couldn't be so strong when you were holding it in your hand that you microwaved your own brains using the phone system. So if you were standing here now and had the phone system, it could not penetrate this glass window. Okay? It could not penetrate brick. It couldn't go inside a building. I would have to go out on that patio or to some open area to get the system to work. So again, remember, this was in the era of cell phones. Okay? This is in an area where everyone was used to their phone being able to ring indoors. Also, the same problem was compounded by if it was raining or snowing and there were physical things in the way, you would not get reception. That would block the reception coming in from the sky. Also, because the signal had to travel so far, for those of you who remember the speed of light, even the speed of light going halfway around the world, there's a delay, and it's like talking to the space station. There's not an interactive conversation like, I'm on my way home, what are we doing for dinner? It would have to be, I'm on my way home, over. What are we doing for dinner? Over. And it just couldn't have what's commonly expected, how normal people have an interactive phone conversation. And to be fair, listen, I am picking on them kind of hard, and it's easy to judge them looking back, but what I'm trying to do is hold this up as an example of how technically elegant products do not always automatically mean you have a market. So, again, they targeted the business traveler. I would have done some simple market validation before deciding on the business traveler, and it would have been the following. Number one, I probably would do a series of interviews, and you'll learn more about these as we get more into this workshop. And I would talk to a group of people like you, okay? And I would probably talk to dozens and dozens of people like you. And my line of questioning would not be, would you like a satellite phone with one phone number that rings anywhere, okay? My line of questioning would be, how often do you travel internationally? When you travel internationally, how do you stay in communications? How often do you call home? How often do you call the office? Who covers those charges? How often do you use email, right? Internationally, email is a huge competitor with the phone system. Who pays when you use the phone? You know, is this a personal expense if you call home, or is it a business expense? You know, I would get all the usage patterns down. I'd never ask them if they want the phone system to start anyway, but I would understand what kind of usage patterns they experience overseas. And by the way, the subsequent studies have shown that what most people do is they keep their one cell phone they have. They may consider turning it on in the new place, or they may not, depending on the cost, or they might buy a temporary one, depending on the cost. But frequently, if they're worried about emergency contact, they'll leave a list of the offices they'll be at, the hotels they'll be at, and the cell phones of the people they'll be with. Okay, so it's not like there's always a direct need to always have a phone with you when traveling internationally. So that would have been one thing. I doubt I would have gotten a lot of positive feedback from that survey. Okay, and when we look at the surveys, you'll see what I mean by positive feedback when I show you some of the real results. But just to make sure, I would do a little test, a little market test. And again, I'd walk into a room like this, where surely there are a lot of you, I'm sure many of you, most of you travel internationally to some degree or another. And I'd come up and say, hey, I'll tell you what, I'll make you a deal. I will pay your cell phone charges for 3 months. You can call anywhere you want, I'll cover them. In exchange for that, there's a couple things I want you to do though. First of all, I want you to tape this brick to your cell phone to sort of emulate the heaviness of the system and the clunkiness of the system. Secondly, you can only use this cell phone outside. And by the way, you couldn't use it in a car. Once the car started moving more than like 30 miles an hour, the satellite couldn't keep up with the speed. So you can only use it standing still and outside. And the third thing is, I forgot to mention to you, it was expensive. I'm going to show you what your phone bill would have been using my satellite system. And the satellite system ran about $10 a minute. That was about, by the time you amortized buying the headset and the per call charges, it was around $10 a minute. So I doubt if I made that offer to everyone in this room, anybody would have really taken me up on it, okay? So and that's an overly simplistic example, but what I'm trying to emphasize is it would have been so much easier to figure some of these things out beforehand. Okay, basic laws of physics say the signal strength is going to be weak when it gets down here. You don't have to build the system to know that. You know that the signal has to travel a long way. You know there's going to be a propagation delay. You know the battery supply has to be big. You know there's going to be components that have to be plugged in before you build this kind of thing. You need to test that the product's still viable. If you fast forward the tape, there's an interesting, very interesting kind of end of the story. The company went into bankruptcy. Obviously, they couldn't pay their debts based on the revenues of the company. Of course, it's an American company, so everybody sued everybody for some period of time. And once all the lawyers made out, there was the company went into bankruptcy and was purchased by an investor about 6 years ago for about $80 million. So the $8 billion investment originally was sort of artificially reduced to $80 million by the bankruptcy procedure. So for every dollar of investment that went in, a penny came back. Under that new shrunk down capitalization, it's a thriving business and very profitable. And they focus on disaster areas. When a tornado, hurricane, earthquake, which, business has been good on that front lately. It happens, you know, it knocks out the electricity, which knocks out the cellular infrastructure, and classically the copper lines get broken in one form or another. So it goes into disaster areas, it goes into military areas, it goes into Antarctic and Arctic expeditions, it's backup communications for ships at sea, it's backup communications for oil rigs. It's many of the new Boeing and Airbus planes actually use it for telemetry, you know, for low priority communications back to headquarters kinds of things. So it actually, in the niche markets where it really fits, it's doing very well now under an artificially shrunk capitalization structure. Okay? So again, it's not that the product wasn't needed. It's just that the price point it was delivered was outside the ability of ordinary people to pay for it. So I use that as an example just to show how technically elegant things that are hard to build can get built, but you got to make sure there's a real market with people willing to pay for them. Compare and contrast that with the iPod. The iPod actually does not have any real technology breakthroughs in it. It is a design triumph on many fronts. It's got what I like to call the Apple reality distortion field in it. You know, when people get around Apple products, they kind of get sucked in. You know, all comments. I don't know how Steve Jobs does it. I think there's some kind of chemical they put in the plastic or something. What Apple spends a lot of time doing customer research. They won't admit it, but they do. And we'll talk about how Apple would have done this when we get into the third section. But Apple was roundly criticized when the iPod came out, okay? And the criticism was, wait a minute, you're selling these multi-$1,000 units to corporations, universities, high-end users, and Steve Jobs, you're going to sell this cigarette pack-sized music box to teenagers for $500? What's going on here? And Apple was roundly criticized when it was released back in October of 2001. They did the right thing, and they really narrowly focused on a tight market. They focused on people who were sophisticated enough to know how to copy their own music initially, and people who had Macintoshes. Okay? So again, good entrepreneurial thing. Tight feature set, tight market. I can get to it. I can do very well in it. Okay? That had the usual Apple effect. Over time, they slowly added additional things like the ability to run on a PC, the ability to get music into it, and other things. But it took almost 2 years of sales and marketing effort. If you look at the stock price, 18 months later, the stock was below the price that the iPod originally shipped at. Now, an elegant product, no technical breakthroughs, high consumer desirability, no question about it. But do you know what feature came out in May of 2003 and caused the stock price to go up significantly? Anybody want to guess? iTunes. Okay? The real customer requirement was, is there a simple, inexpensive way, first of all, not to have to buy the whole CD for the 1 or 2 songs I really want, and secondly, to get the music off the CD and onto the player. Now, you know, hackers, whatever, knew how to do this, so they didn't mind doing it. But for it to go mainstream, it needed a simple and elegant way, number 1, to get the music, and number 2, to get it on the iPod. And that's what happened, and the thing absolutely took off. So my view of it is, elegantly designed device, no question about it. But the key component that was missing was simple, easy way to get songs over onto it. And that's what really caused us to take off. And the only way you're going to find that out, that need for songs, is to do good, thorough market validation. Okay? So what I'm trying to compare and contrast here is Iridium, technically elegant, market failure. iPod, technically, you know, no breakthroughs, design-wise very elegant, market breakthrough, iTunes causes the product to take off. You know, Apple's capitalization is now more than Microsoft's. So, questions on either one of those? Yes, James.
Reading between the lines, are you sort of saying, or do you know that iTunes was a result of the sort of market validation or customer research?
Yes, yes. You know, they knew about iTunes when they shipped the iPod, They just knew that they couldn't get that out immediately. And you'll see more when I get into market validation. I agree with the strategy they took. Get a product out there that might not be fully functional, but does the job, and build on it. Don't try to keep it inside till you build the perfect thing, which is what technically most people tend to do. Another good example is when they built the iPhone, the first iPhone, they actually pulled GPS positioning out of it at the last minute. They couldn't get it to work. So rather than keep the product internal and fix the GPS part of it, they shipped it. And by the way, at least the iPhone 3 has it, I know, by the time positioning went into it, you didn't even have to do GPS anymore. You know, there was the ability to triangulate off cell towers, which was a more inexpensive and just as efficient way. So again, they're good at not getting everything into the market, everything into the product. They're good at getting into the market and then continuously improving it, right? So yes. Other questions on this? Okay, so the question is, I think what you're asking, and correct me if I'm wrong, is Apple the kind of place that sort of tells people what they want by showing them what can be, or do they really use some kind of market strategy? And my view is they use a market strategy. And I'll show you how they do this when we get into the ready, aim, fire, you know, sort of second or third part of the session. But by understanding everything about how music people react to, you know, what kind of components they have currently, how much they spend each year on content, by really understanding everything about that user, they get inside that user's head and then they understand what they can technically do, okay? And they come back with prototypes and say, hey, is this something you're interested in? A way to better say this is, I couldn't pick up the phone before the iPod was around and say, hey, do you want an iPod? Right? Because nobody knew what it was. So how was I able to pull the fact that an iPod would be a market hit out of a market that didn't know what it was? Okay? So first of all, the iPod was not the first music player. Okay? There were lots of, you know, MP2, MP3, then MP4 players out on the market, but they were from no-name companies. You had to be a rocket scientist to really get tunes over on them, and they weren't particularly good quality. What Apple really did, again, this was not a breakthrough product, it was a breakthrough design. And by understanding what's going on inside the user's head, they're able to see what the issues are, go back into their mad scientist lab, come up with a couple options, and go back and present them to people and say, hey, what do you think of this? What do you think of this? What do you think of this? And what I propose, or what you'll see in the market validation piece, is you do the exact same thing. The difference is you don't have to build the product. You have to build a one-paragraph, three-sentence description of what you're going to do. And I've worked with a lot of companies a lot of times, and just getting a one-paragraph, three-sentence description out of the company can be a lot of work. But by using that approach, and I'll show you how to do it, and I'll show you how you can test it in a very objective way, you don't have to build anything. You can use descriptions and customer reactions to those descriptions as your sort of way of figuring out what the market wants. And if you need to change what the product is, you just got to rearrange the paragraph. You don't have to go build another product. And I know that sounds overly simplistic. I would argue that most people who have sales and marketing experience know it's very true, and those of you who are technically oriented might not be as confident in it. But ultimately, if I cannot explain to a customer what my product is in 30 seconds, the equivalent of that paragraph, I'm not going to be able to sell it. There's not enough time and energy in the world to get them to buy that thing. Okay? Nothing's worse than an entrepreneur coming up to me and saying, I got this great new idea. I go, oh yeah, what is it? Well, sit down. You know, let me buy you a couple beers because that's how long it's going to take to tell you. Okay? No, give me the one paragraph, 3 or 4 sentence version of it. So in a lot of ways, that forces that kind of discipline. Okay, so the question is, how easy is it to get taken in by the early adopters, and their needs are typically different than the early majority? Best answered when we go through I will show you what is meant by that. The quick answer is, I'm not sure I buy the early adopter market thing, because the challenge is, in an early adopter market, you're losing money because you have to educate the market. I'd rather have a market that was somewhat educated and a little farther along the curve that I can get into.
Yeah, but they tend to agree with all your propositions, and they're saying it sounds fantastic, exactly what I want. And you go along, it's easy to go along with that.
Yeah, but if you get a good early adopter, they will also tell you, they won't agree with everything you have to say. They'll tell you what they want, what they think is necessary. And I'll show you how to get to those people when we get in this. Any other questions before I sort of move on here? Let me just take a quick look here. Okay, so how does all this sort of get fixed now that I've outlined a good problem for you? And again, the answer is market validation, okay? So what we're doing is we're taking what is really a very unstructured and very serendipitous task of figuring out what the market wants, okay? And when I say that, I'm putting a framework on a process, but the process has to be able to capture what you talked about. How does Apple figure out that the market wants an iPod without being able to say, do you want an iPod, right? So that's kind of, it sounds like a tough problem to fix, but there are many ways to do it that will get you the answer that if you have the technical knowledge of what can be built, you understand the market problem, you're able to sort of address that. Remember, what investors ultimately want is a smart team with a really big market problem. Okay, investors want a smart team with a big market problem. Why? Because if I've got a market problem and smart people, they'll figure out how to fix the market problem. Whether that's, whether that's through technology or competitive advantage or large amounts of capital or expertise or whatever, that team will figure it out. What's a good market problem? A good market problem has three characteristics. One is a high sense of urgency. Okay, I've got to fix it and I've got to fix it now. The second one is ubiquitous. There are many people with the problem. And the third thing is people are willing to pay. Okay, they are willing to pay to fix the problem.